The woman was standing close enough to kiss. Her eyes were shut. There wasn't room to move my head properly. Over her shoulder, I could see a man pulling postage stamps from a clear plastic envelope. He held them with peculiar delicacy, the nail of his forefinger resting on the front, the tip of his second finger supporting the back. His rapt calm struck me as a marvelous contrast with the rest of the carriage. Everyone else's expressions spoke of a passionate lack of attention. Even if our eyes were open, it was as if our faces were shut, as though we were continuously recoiling from each other and our environment. The air was like soup. It struck me as a macabre joke that the man at my elbow was reading a book called The Second Coming of the Black Death. I had the job. The fact we were rehearsing in Bethnal Green in the East End meant that I was spending about 2.5, 3 hours a day on these trains. To this, I attributed a strange torpor. I felt as though I'd been coshed and somehow robbed of the top 10% of my mental faculties. I was possessed of the possibly self-contradictory feeling that I wasn't feeling everything I ought to be. For example, joining an acting company is usually exciting. Team spirit has to be forged. Charming each other is literally part of the job. In this case, there were 9 others. All were attractive. All seemed friendly, but I couldn't seem to make a connection. I had never heard of the Spice Girls or Oasis. They treated these lacunae in my knowledge kindly as if they were evidence of a disability, but they were all too young to have worked before I'd left for Canada, but experienced enough that they had plenty of connections amongst themselves. I tried going to the pub after rehearsals a few times. The conversation faltered. Last place I lived before I moved to Canada was round here. There was a bath in the kitchen. Really? Yeah. What I hate about the bath in the kitchen story is it doesn't go anywhere. No, it's interesting. A bath in a kitchen, really? I don't think you were in Canada at all. I think you were in prison the whole time. The play is a celebration of the 1960s, and it describes, by means of rhapsodic monologues, short scenes, and songs, how one man traveled the world in that era, experiencing wonders and novelties, only to discover upon his return that his hometown had changed in exactly the way he had. I played the traveler, the rest of them doubled as the band and the people I met. I spent the weekends at home. I didn't see anybody. I didn't see anybody in that place for a long time. I mean, I gathered that the woman who lived downstairs was Irish and somehow responsible for the place. One night she had 2 teenage girls staying. In the middle of the night, I heard a young man saying, "Come on, missus, you were one once," over and over. But other than that, there was no noise. The mail was always laid neatly on the bottom step. I knew that the man I shared toilet and shower with smoked because I heard him coughing really early every morning. I knew he liked cricket from hearing the television commentary come from his room. I knew his hair was grey from seeing the stuff that clogged up the drain in the shower. And the shower was in a room so small that once I'd closed the door, there was scarcely room to bend over to undress. And once I had done, I had to scrunch my clothing up tightly and jam it against the base of the unit. But then the rail that held up the curtain had rotted away. So as soon as my back got wet and stuck to the maroon plastic curtain, the slightest movement would dislodge curtain and rail together, allowing the shower to pour directly onto my clothing. I'd look out of the slatted windows at the garden next door and wonder when my real life was going to begin. That first weekend, I did finally see one of my fellow tenants. A woman at the front door had dropped her keys. I picked them up and handed them to her and said, "I live here now." "No," she said. Yeah, I do. I just moved in a few weeks ago." She just shook her head and said, "No." "Yeah, I do. I'm in the room at the top of the stairs." But by then she knew how to deal with my kind. "No." She went in and shut the door behind her. In the second week of rehearsals, Mike, who'd been around in the 1960s, wondered aloud whether the speeches could perhaps reflect the era with a little more accuracy. The playwright just said the speeches were going to stay the same and left. That was all right. I mean, I thought the monologues were very beautiful and that I never did them justice. But it meant that from then on, all the excitement of rehearsals really centered around the band. Because we weren't playing the theatre itself, but the massive rock venue next door to the theatre, which meant in the rehearsal room was this enormous PA, bigger than any of us had ever enjoyed singing through before, so the band were sounding pretty amazing. When I came down with flu-like symptoms that week, I was almost relieved because it gave me an excuse for feeling the way I felt or not feeling the way I didn't feel. I got better, but then over the weekend I came down with it again, and by the third week I was properly unwell. But by then it was too late to take any time off, so I just sat for days with the speeches crumpled in my lap on this big old sofa that was covered with this rug made out of fluorescent green nylon fur that somebody said was infested. I wondered, could this be true? Do nits live in nylon? And because of the state I was in, I just became kind of stupidly fascinated by this question as though it were a Zen riddle. Do nits live in nylon? And as difficult as traveling was, on the days when there was a complete strike over the entire underground network, it became completely unreasonable. Then, even in a vehicle, it would take 3 hours to get across town, and many struggled to get into vehicles, as on those days the city became more itself, a hive of broken promises. And so on one of these days, when I was unwell, I was sent home early with instructions to get home and get better. I remember standing at the corner of Bethnal Green Road, and this bus came along that had a vaguely city centre destination on it. Reasoning that was at least halfway home, I just got on it and was disappointed when we started to inch north instead of west. One look at the area that we were passing through, London Fields, told me it was just dreary, so I laid my mind out in a deep public transport trance. It was only when we got to Hackney and still didn't turn west, but carried on heading north, I had this kind of flicker of awakening going, you know, at this rate, we're going to end up coming to an area that I hadn't been to in 19 years and I'd hoped never to return to ever again. I told myself it was unlikely because a feature of the area, as I well remembered, was that it was really difficult to get in and out of. But then I wondered, is there something familiar about the number of the bus route? And sure enough, 45 minutes later, we came to this enormous roundabout. It was nothing really but a symmetrical mound covered in turf, so large it cut off the view in every direction, except off in the distance, you could, about a quarter of a mile away, you could see one little sign that said kebab. Well, as featureless as this place was, it was scored in my memory. I knew it was the gateway to the area that I lived in the first time I ever actually moved to London. I was 23 years old. I'd been acting for several years, sometimes in successful plays. I knew it was time to move to London. And I remember the landlady ushered me into the apartment she lived in downstairs and made a show of scrutinizing me. And she offered me a place on the top floor, sharing with 3 other young unemployed actors, one of whom I knew already. My room was the smallest. There was a leak in the ceiling. And what happened was one of the strangers befriended me, annoying the old friend so much that one Sunday morning he punched me on the nose without warning and stormed into his room, slamming the door behind him. The other stranger never left his room. He just sat there for days on end with the curtains drawn, sipping Stone's ginger wine, always Stone's ginger wine, always listening to the same Rolling Stones record, Some Girls, over and over. One of the others told me that he worked in a pinball parlor in the West End, and it was pointed out to me he always wore discreet mascara. I couldn't understand why anyone would wear makeup when they were on their own. I liked him when we got speaking. His humour was wry. The landlady's daughter lived downstairs as well. She was around 50, I'd guess. Always wore dirty pink. And the old lady berated her as if she was a small girl. You'd see her at the shops swiping her across the head. And she was married, I presumed married off, to a man of about 70, who had no chin. By that, I don't mean that he looked ineffectual because he had a small chin, but that between his lower lip and his Adam's apple was nothing. He wasn't trusted with the front door key, so sometimes I'd come home and I'd find him standing by the step. I'm not proud to say that at 23 I found it possible to feel like the unluckiest person in London just for standing near this man. And from somewhere I had the idea that I should explore London theatre, go out there, make connections, form opinions, make alliances. But as soon as I tried, I ran out of money. But then if I stayed home, I felt like I wasn't doing anything for myself. In the end, I took a job with no promise of payment, just a cut to the box office, doing a lunchtime play at a venue that was struggling to survive and in fact perished soon after, in a room above the King's Head pub in Putney, which is to say about as far from my northeasterly location as possible. I remember when we moved into the theatre and I met the producer for the first time. He was an Australian with an inexplicable Scots accent, who told me straight away that he had a favourite drink, which was half bitter, half barley wine, that he called rubbish. Pint of rubbish, please. And his girlfriend, who had a limp from childhood polio, financed the theatre by stripping in the local pubs. I remember at the dress rehearsal, we had to cut the dream sequence because the music frightened the landlord's dog. I had friends, who were working at the Royal Shakespeare Company in the Royal Court. In some ways, I think that the early part of an actor's career can be the most difficult bit because that's the period when every month of struggle can seem to be a realistic indicator of what's in store for decades to come. It's only a few years earlier. Success, it seemed like a dream for everyone, a dream. No one's going to be successful. It was worse somehow when some people were, and I wasn't. Once the run of that play started, I had to leave home mid-morning every morning, often with a bag full of my belongings, so I could sell them in the West End while changing buses. Then after I'd done the show, I'd be wanting to hang around the bar for a little while just in case there was any encouraging rumours that I might pick up. And of course, I had a few quid from selling my records on the way, so buy a drink. It wasn't sensible buying a drink because drinking at lunchtime just made my thinking more long-term and emphatic. So after one, I'd be like, it's going to be a bit of a scrap this year. After two, I'd be like, it's going to be a struggle this decade. After three, I'd be thinking, it's never going to be better than this. I remember one time as I was wending my way home from this show, I stopped in a cheap cafe in the West End, and I heard this guy at the next table saying, society hates you. So you come to hate yourself. You take that message inside your heart and you start to do society's work for it. Never heard an argument like that before. I thought it was brilliant. Turned and looked. The speaker was black with a greying beard, leaning forward, intent, but I couldn't see who he was speaking to, and I tried to catch a glimpse as I left the cafe. No one. There was no one there. He was healing the heart of thin air. But actually, the real kind of moral apocalypse for me came a little while after that. I went to a concert on the way home from, and so I ended up in the middle of London after the public transport had ended. And what I didn't know, even as I clutched all my money thinking it's going to take just about my entire life savings to get home, I didn't know that taxis weren't obliged to take people beyond a couple of miles outside the city centre. Of course, it being London, nobody explains that to you. So I just get a taxi to stop. The guy would stare forward. I'd lean in. I'd announce the area I was heading for, and he'd just drive off. No explanation. Oh, in the end, I walked home, all the way home, just to prove to this town how it's just oafishly big, much too stupidly big. Did it listen? Did it help? I hated it. I didn't like the way it was so competitive. I thought it was wrong the way people confused the city with the profession and the profession with the art. I didn't like the way it was so indifferent. I didn't like the way that the way I didn't like it made it more difficult. You're getting more boring. Boring. By the end of that run, I was down to just one record that I hadn't managed to sell. I retreated to my room and I just listened to it over and over. By then, all of the roommates were not talking to each other. I think we just all saw each other as evidence of how badly things were going. I didn't even tell them when one day through the mail came a script together with an offer of a job in Birmingham. I left town the next day, still owing 2 weeks' rent, carrying everything I owned. And I hadn't ever been back to the area since that day, 19 years. It kind of amused me that I'd only come back accidentally. I'd kind of felt like I'd been forced back, and that now I was forced to go through it so slowly because the traffic was so clogged. I squirmed in my seat looking for the house. Back in the old days, it seemed enormous and wrapped in shadows, but too disappointing in its details to be termed Gothic. It was kind of crack Gothic. Couldn't see it. I was surprised to note on the other side of the road, there was a park. Recollection hadn't allowed for anything as comforting as a park. It was an unnerving view because it reminded me that my problem was not the area, which after all had been easy enough to stay away from for 19 years, but my imagination, which was harder to avoid. You know, in the years following, I tried moving into London several times. Each time was a little bit better. The second time, for example, was over in the West, so as far away from my original choice as possible, in Acton. And I remember on the first Saturday, we had a celebration. The landlord made me coffee in the Yugoslav manner and told me how he'd been raised in a Yugoslav orphanage and how long after he'd moved to London, he'd had to go to the Yugoslav embassy, not knowing whether he would be allowed out again or simply grabbed and turfed into the Yugoslav army that day. Now, he obviously hadn't been enlisted and had emerged and been able to write a short novel in poetic prose that he'd had to publish himself called The Endless Search, about a man who'd been raised in a Yugoslav orphanage and wandered the world looking for love. I was pleased to raise a cup to Živa's continued presence amongst us and his search for a voice. I was writing myself in those days, and the lodger who lived down the hall also claimed to be writing, but it used to irritate me because he claimed to be able to write an entire play in a weekend. Sometimes he would stand at my elbow as I was trying to work with a kind of restless, quizzical air, as though wondering how I could make such a simple task so difficult. If you need any one-liners, just let me know, he'd say. The other thing he did was he used to claim to have gone to the same college as me. It was weird because it was only a small college. So it didn't make sense that we didn't have any people in common. And it was kind of a rubbish college, so it didn't make sense that he would lie about going there. What happened was Siva got tired of allowing us to use his phone. So when someone offered me work, I never found out for weeks until it was too late. I fell behind on my rent. We both felt aggrieved. And just as we were facing off about this, his 2 pet ducks were discovered murdered one morning in the back garden. I remember the lodger said to me, the weird thing is, he said, is I was just writing this play called Who Killed the Quacking Ducks? And that seemed to me like a complete waste of an uncanny coincidence. I left town shortly after, this time just owing 1 week's rent, so I was getting better, and moved back, and it was better again. And eventually everything was fine. I was living in Bethnal Green with a bath in the kitchen, but I still left and moved to Toronto. It was as if I'd never forgiven the place for that first attempt. So it was interesting to be reminded of all of that. It made me think I understood a little better how it had been so easy to move to Canada. What I couldn't understand was how come I'd come back. And not only had I come back, but it sort of insisted on staying in the same kind of accommodation. I mean, I could have stayed at David, but no, I'm going back to. When rehearsals for the play reached a certain point, we moved into the theatre, which was about 3 or 4 miles away from where I lived. Much easier to get to. I felt 10 years younger, but we had real technical difficulties, so we ended up only having 1 day off in 3 weeks, so the tiredness returned. Opening night was exciting though. The band sounded absolutely fantastic. I did my best with the speeches. Mike hugged me after, saying, "We're back," although we never worked together again. I had a brief glimpse of the writer smiling and waving as he was being dragged away on a tide of strangers. In a stairwell was a young man playing a didgeridoo. That night, we were the cool place where the man with the didgeridoo went to strut his stuff. The reviews came out the next day. They were fine. No one came. Within a week, we were roping off all but the first 3 rows of the auditorium. Explanations were improvised. It's because it's summer, nobody ever comes to shows in the summer. It always takes people 3 months to find a play. But we didn't mind, really. I mean, it was a lovely show to do, and Mike's daughter brought her friends at 3 times a week, each time dressed in more outlandish outfits, and hence appropriate outfits. I mean, the purpose of that show was just to be their version of the 1960s. The cast were quite happy with that. I knew I wasn't going to get an agent with this, so I just came in and did the job every night, concentrated on not worrying about being back. I hung around in the vast cavernous bar after the show, ran into a few old acquaintances, most of whom, I think, regarded me as just kind of proof that even the most unconsidered trifles from the past can turn up again. One night near the end of the run, the guitar player, who was the only non-actor in the company, gave me a lift home. It was like he wanted to talk to me about some spirit amongst the rest of the cast that he felt he couldn't penetrate. I tried to explain. I said, I think it might be that you can't really act on your own. Try it and you're just talking to the wall. It's other people make it acting. So I think when actors are in work, they all tend to stick together, telling each other, "Oh, you're really real. You're a real actor. Really, you are. You're an actor. What? Who, me? Yeah, you're incredible. Incredible. You're the real thing." It's just like a service that we do for each other. While I was concocting that theory, I was forgetting that it also applied to me, because after I'd attended our modest closing night celebration at the Polish restaurant across the road, I walked home. By the time I got there, I wasn't an actor anymore. I got in, I remember that night, the lights in the stairs were off. The light in the toilet had gone. So I clicked on my lighter to see my way, and my foot landed in something soft. So I stooped to see what it was. It was a pile of shit. And as I'm crouching there, moving the lighter around, seeing the eerie, flickering light, there's piles of shit all over the room. But like it seemed to me scattered too far and wide to be anything like an accident. I had this image of my fellow lodger doing this weird, spiteful rumba, and I had to calm myself down to reflect that, well, probably what it was, he was staggering uncontrollably. Still weird enough. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. There was nothing I thought I could do about it at the time. So when it was still there in the morning, I bought Dettol and some rubber gloves, and I spent an hour cleaning it fiercely. And oddly enough, felt more at home after I'd done that than I ever had before. A few nights later, about 6:30 in the evening, the doorbell rang. Normally the woman downstairs answered it, but in this case, it just kept ringing. So finally I went down. I opened the door, and there was this man standing on the step, older guy with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper mustache, swaying with the key in his hand. He said, "Sorry, half pissed. Couldn't manage the door." I understood. Half pissed meant I know it's a door. So I stepped aside, let him ooze his way in. And he started swaying up the stairs. And halfway up, he turned and said to me, "Are you the tenant on the same landing as me? Welcome. Welcome. If ever you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Turned back round, started heading up the stairs. A couple of steps in, turned again. Don't hesitate. And here I'd been thinking they were all unfriendly and cold.